Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows comes the best of indie podcasts. His name was Vesago, and claimed to be over 500 years old. Responsible for the double homicide of the parents of a fellow member inside their vampire clan. But in reality, Vesago's real name was Roderrick Justin Ferrell. And despite claiming his advanced age, Rod would go on to become the youngest person on Florida's death row at the time. My name is DJ, and this is the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Hello, and welcome to tonight's show. Mythical True Crime is now part of the Darkcast network of indie podcast creators. And with that, coming soon to the podcast app near you, comes the Darkcast network presenting Cruel Summer. In the heat, it may be unbearable, but our stories will chill you to the bone. A special event running July 10th and July 11th, you'll hear stories from other Darkcast network creators, including myself, DJ, with special stories to hopefully cool you down this summer. My contribution to the Cruel Summer event will be a story that inspired the Friday the 13th film franchise. Now you can learn about this and all other upcoming events in the future by following me on Twitter, Instagram, and including the Darkcast network on the same social media channels. I've also started the process of uploading my podcasts to YouTube so you can view them as you would listen to any podcast of mine. So stay tuned for that. There are episodes uploaded now, and more will be added in the future. If you like what you hear or you see, please consider subscribing. You can also support me monetarily on my Patreon and also on the Buzzsprout link below. Doing so will help me continue to make the content that you enjoy. And with that, let's continue on to tonight's story. So, Rod Ferrell was born on the 28th of March, 1980, to his mother, Sandra Gibson, who was only 17 years old at the time. His father, Rick Ferrell, who was also a teenager, the couple married 9 days after Rod's birth, but only separated weeks later. Now, Rick Ferrell filed for divorce and enlisted in the military, while Sandra took custody of their child. Now, this is a trigger warning for anyone, so you can pause now and skip ahead 15 seconds. Now, Rod's grandparents also played a role in the caring for him. However, disturbingly, Rod claimed that his own grandfather sexually assaulted him when he was only 5 years old. Rod further asserted that during his childhood, he was exposed to occult rituals, human sacrifices, things of that sort, and was introduced into the role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons. Now, Sandra Gibson eventually remarried and frequently relocated with Rod, eventually settling and leaving him in Murray, Kentucky. Later, she joined her new husband in Michigan and left Rod by himself. She allegedly informed Rod that they would never return, which deeply distressed him. Gibson ultimately divorced her second husband and then returned to Murray just to be with Rod. Her second husband was also reportedly involved in satanic rituals, but my research couldn't confirm any of that. Now, around this time, Rod began to undergo a transformation of sorts. He frequented cemeteries at night, engaged in self-harm, and offered his blood to others, claimed to be a 500-year-old vampire he named himself Vesago. His academic performance suffered, and he openly flouted his rules to his school, skipping classes, smoking on campus, and exhibiting other defiance towards teachers and school authorities. Now, additionally, he immersed himself in playing a role-playing game called Vampire: The Masquerade, which is a pretty realistic role-playing game centered around vampiric scenarios. Now, Rod's mother allowed him to stay out all night, indulge in drug use, and even skip school. He frequently spent time with a young man named Stephen Murray. who introduced Ferrell to the vampire subculture and initiated him, bestowing him with the name Vesago. By the spring of 1996, Rod engaged in long distance conversations with a woman named Heather Wendorf. She purportedly informed him that her parents were mistreating her and expressed a desire for him to rescue her from them, even if it required killing them. September 1996, Murphy, with an individual whose first name was not provided, attacked Ferrell, but later refused medical treatment and was taken to a local hospital. Murphy later was convicted for assault. Shortly thereafter, Sandra Gibson faced charges for soliciting a minor, Murphy's 14-year-old brother, with whom she exchanged love letters, urging him to initiate her into the vampiric lifestyle as his bride. Functioning as the leader of a teenage vampire cult, Ferrell allegedly received assistance from his then girlfriend Charity Lynn Kesey and two other members affiliated with the cult. The events leading up to these heinous acts began on the 22nd of November. Late that night or early morning on the 23rd, Ferrell, along with Kesey and two other cult associates, Howard Scott Anderson and Dana Cooper, departed for Murray, Kentucky, Ferrell's hometown, to journey to Eustis, Florida. Now, on the way there, the 25th of November, the day of the murders, Ferrell and his accomplices were stopped and questioned by law enforcement officers due to a flat tire on their vehicle. This unexpected circumstance altered Ferrell's plans. He confided in Wendorf and another friend, Janine Leclerc, about the situation and allegedly discussed a plan with the group to kill Wendorf's parents and utilize their Ford Explorer as their getaway vehicle because his was just unreliable. Ferrell and his friends arrived near the Wendorf residence and met Heather Wendorf, a short distance away from her house. Ferrell dispatched three young women, Heather, Cooper, and Kesey, to Heather's boyfriend and pick up Leclerc. Ferrell and Anderson remained behind, but armed with clubs. The two young men scoured the exterior of the Wendorf residence, searching for the means of entry. They accessed the house through an unlocked door in the garage and scoured the garage for more suitable weapons. Ultimately, Ferrell settled on a crowbar. Ferrell and Anderson proceeded to enter the house, disconnecting one of the telephone lines from the wall. They encountered 49-year-old Richard Wendorf, who was asleep on the couch. Ferrell mercilessly struck him in the head multiple times with the crowbar, causing skull fractures and numerous chest wounds, including fractured ribs. As Richard Wendorf lay dying, Naoma Queen, his wife, emerged from the bathroom and encountered Ferrell in the kitchen. Ferrell had bloodstains on his clothing and brandished the crowbar. Queen retaliated by throwing hot coffee at him and engaging in a struggle, but Ferrell overpowered her and repeatedly struck her in the head with the crowbar. With Heather's parents deceased, the two young men ransacked the house, taking Richard's Discover card and keys to the Explorer, which they utilized to flee the scene. They subsequently reunited with the girls, who were returning to the vicinity of the house in a Buick Skyhawk, which they had initially driven from Kentucky. The group utilized both vehicles to travel to Sanford, a nearby location, where they abandoned the Buick. They swapped the license plate, fixed the Buick's plates to the stolen Explorer, and left the Buick and the plates in the stolen vehicle. The five individuals, which consisted at this time of Ferrell, Anderson, Kesey, Cooper, and Wendorf, proceeded westward to Interstate 10, passing through Tallahassee and heading towards New Orleans, reportedly to meet with renowned vampire author Anne Rice. They made a stop in Crestview, Florida, where they used Richard Wendorf's pilfered Discover card to purchase gasoline and a knife. One of the group members placed a phone call from Baton Rouge to Charity Kesey's family, leading to their eventual capture. Ferrell's confessions were captured on videotape, with slight variations in his statements given. Subsequently, four of the suspects, the two male individuals, Dana Cooper and Heather Wendorf, were all charged with murder, while Kesey faced charges of being an accessory after the fact. On the 17th of December 1996, Ferrell and Anderson were indicted by a grand jury. However, Heather Wendorf was not indicted. On February 12, 1998, then 17-year-old Ferrell pleaded guilty to the murders, claiming that the others traveling with him were innocent, except Scott Anderson, who was simply an accessory. Ferrell pleaded guilty to 2 counts of felony murder. Now, Ferrell's attorneys tried to argue that he was insane. I mean, obviously, with this whole story. He's been diagnosed at that time with mental disorders, including schizotypal personality disorder and Asperger syndrome. Asperger syndrome is also known as Asperger's, is a neurodevelopmental condition characterized by significant difficulties in social interactions and nonverbal communication, along with restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior and interest. Interestingly enough, the syndrome is actually no longer recognized as a diagnosis in and of itself, but having been merged with other conditions into the autism spectrum disorder. It was considered to differ from other diagnoses that were merged into ASD by relatively impaired or unimpaired spoken language and intelligence. The University of Florida further attested that Rod could sometimes witness spiritual things, such as angels and even demons. Judge presiding over the case was named Jerry T. Lockett. He sentenced Ferrell to death. Charity Kesey was convicted of 2 counts of third-degree murder, robbery with a gun or deadly weapon, and burglary armed with a weapon or explosives. She was sentenced to 10.5 years in state prison. Dana Cooper was convicted of those charges as well, but was given 17.5-year prison sentence. Anderson was convicted of the same charges as Ferrell and was sentenced to life in prison. Now, for 2 years, Ferrell held the record as the youngest inmate on death row until November 2000, when the Florida Supreme Court reduced his sentence to life in prison. Now, because Florida had a long abolished parole system, the sentence is without it. Kesey was released from prison in March 2006, and Cooper was released from prison October 2011. In January 2013, the court dismissed attempts by Roderrick Ferrell and Howard Scott Anderson to get a new sentence hearing. However, in December 2018, Howard Scott Anderson was resentenced by a circuit judge, Don Briggs, to 40 years in prison. Anderson was given credit for the 22 years he had already been serving with him, first being eligible for release in the year 2031. Wendorf's relatives attended Anderson's resentencing hearing and didn't oppose to his early release. Speaking with the Daily Commercial, they said that they were more concerned about Ferrell, who was scheduled to face his own resentence hearing in that July 2019. Now, Ferrell's resentence hearing was moved to November 18 and then again April 2020, and the sentencing judge upheld his life without parole sentence and deemed him irreparably corrupt. Anderson is currently incarcerated in the Calhoun Correctional Institute, while Ferrell is currently incarcerated in the Northwest Florida Reception Center Annex. A truly horrible mess these murders were. But let's delve a little bit into the vampire folklore, which Ferrell seemed to make his entire personality based in. Now, a vampire is a mythical creature that subsets by feeding vital essences from people, generally in the form of blood from the living. In European folklore, vampires are undead creatures that often visit loved ones or cause mischief or deaths in the neighborhoods, which they inhabited while they were alive. They wore shrouds and were often described as bloated and of ruddy or dark countenance, which basically means like a gaunt or pale vampire, which dates as early as the 19th century. Vampiric entities have also been recorded in cultures all around the world. The term vampire was only popularized in the Western Europe after reports of an 18th century mass hysteria of a pre-existing folk belief in southeastern and eastern Europe that in some cases resulted in corpses being staked and people being accused of vampirism. Local variants in southeastern Europe were also known to be of different names, such as the Strigoi in Romanian. In modern times, the vampire is generally held to be a fictitious entity, although belief in similar vampiric creatures, such as the modern chupacabra, still persist in some cultures. Early folk believe in vampires as something as ascribed to being ignorant of the body's process of decomposition after death, and how people in pre-industrial societies tried to rationalize this, creating figures of a vampire to explain the mysteries of death. After this quick message, we'll be right back. Hello there, listeners. Whether you're new or you've been with me from the start, a great way to catch up and dive deeper into the world of mythical true crime is to check out my earlier shows. I've covered everything from Bigfoot to aliens and ghosts. Take a moment and browse through the past episodes, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Your support means everything to me. Porphyria was linked to legends of vampirism in 1985 and received much media exposure, but it had since been largely discredited. The charismatic and sophisticated vampire of modern fiction was born in 1819 with the publication of The Vampire by the English writer John Polidori. The story was highly successful and arguably the most influential vampire work in the early 19th century. Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, Dracula, is remembered as the quintessential vampire novel and has provided the basis of the modern vampire legend, even though it was published after fellow Irish author Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's 1872 novel, Parmia. The success of the book spawned a distinctive vampire genre, still popular in the 21st century with books, films, television shows, and video games. The vampire has since become a dominant figure in the horror genre. Now, these folk beliefs in this notion of vampirism has existed for a millennia. Cultures such as the Mesopotamians, Hebrews, ancient Greeks, and Romans had tales of demons and spirits which are considered precursors to modern vampires. Despite the occurrence of vampiric creatures in ancient civilizations, the folklore for the entity known today as the vampire originates almost exclusively, again, from previous early 18th century southeastern Europe. This was a time when verbal traditions of many ethnic groups of the region were recorded and then published. In most cases, vampires are revenants of evil beings, suicide victims, or witches, but they can also be created by a malevolent spirit possessing a corpse, or by being bitten by a vampire. Belief in such legends becomes so pervasive in some areas that it caused mass hysteria and even public executions of people who are believed to be vampires. Now, it's difficult to make a single or definitive description of the folkloric vampire, though there are several elements common to many of the European legends, such as vampires were usually reported as, again, being bloated in appearance, and purplish, dark-colored skin, almost looking as if dead, which were characteristics being attributed to recent drinking of blood, which was often seen seeping from the sides of the mouth and the nose, which was also seen in its shroud or coffin. And also their left eye was often always open. It would be clad in linen shrouded in its what it was buried in, and its teeth, hair, nails may have grown somewhat and would show generally fangs, but they were not a feature at the time. Chewing sounds were mostly reported emanating from their graves. Now, the causes of vampiric generation, many have varied, again, in the original folklore. In Slavic and Chinese traditions, any corpse that was jumped over by an animal particularly a dog or a cat, was feared to have become one of the undead. A body with a wound that had not been treated with boiling water was also at risk. In Russian folklore, vampires were said to have once been witches and people who had been rebelling against the Russian Orthodox Church when they were alive. In Albanian folklore, the Dampir was a hybrid child of the lythrobic creature with an iron mail shirt, not necessarily a werewolf, but a lugat, a water-dwelling ghost or a monster. In different regions, animals can be revenants as lugats, also living people during their sleep. Now, you might be asking yourself, what are ways to prevent these vampiric tendencies from happening? Well, cultural practices often arose with the intent to prevent recently deceased loved ones from turning into the undead. Burying a corpse upside down was widespread, as was placing earthly objects, such as scythes and sickles, near the grave to satisfy any demons entering the body or to appease the dead, so that they would not wish to arise from their coffin. This method resembles the ancient Greek practice of placing uh, coins in a person's corpse mouth to pay for the toll to cross the river Styx to the underworld. The coin may have been intended to ward off any evil spirits from entering the body, and this may have influenced later vampire folklore. This tradition persisted in modern Greek folklore about a type of vampire creature in which a wax cross and piece of pottery with the inscription Jesus Christ conquers were placed on the corpses to prevent the body from becoming a vampire. Other methods commonly practiced in Europe included severing the tendons at the knees, or placing poppy seeds, millet, or sand on the ground of the gravesite at the presumed vampire. This was really intended to keep the vampire occupied at night by counting all the fallen grains, indicating an association with arithmomania. I apologize if I didn't pronounce that correctly. Similar Chinese narratives state that the vampire being came across a sack of rice, it would have to count every grain. This was a theme encountered in myths in the Indian subcontinent, as well as the South American tales of witches and other sorts of evil and mischievous spirits and beings. Great. So now that we have a way to prevent these vampires, how do we identify them? Well, many rituals were used to identify vampires, one of which, of finding a vampire's grave, involving leading a virgin boy through a graveyard or church grounds on a virgin stallion. The horse would supposedly balk at the grave in question. Generally, a black horse was required, though in Albania it should be white. Holes appeared in the earth over the grave, which are often signs of vampirism. Corpses thought to be vampires were generally described as having a healthier appearance than expected, plump and showing little to no signs of decomposition. In some cases, when suspected graves were opened, villagers even described the corpses as having fresh blood from a victim all over its face. Evidence that a vampire was active in a given locality included death of cattle, sheep, relatives, or neighbors, and folkloric vampires could also make the presence felt by engaging in minor poltergeist-styled activity, such as hurling stones on roofs or moving household objects, even pressing on people in their sleep. Say you couldn't prevent it, and say you couldn't identify them. Here's some protection methods that are known throughout the world, also known as apotropaics. Items able to ward off revenants are common in vampiric folklore tales. Common is garlic. A branch of a wild rose or hawthorn are sometimes associated with causing harm to vampires as well. In Europe, mustard seeds would be sprinkled on the roofs of houses to keep them away. Although not traditionally regarded, mirrors have been used to ward off vampires when placed facing outwards on a door. This attribute is not universal, however, which Greek-type vampires were capable of both reflection and shadow. The not casting of a shadow perhaps was a manifestation of a vampire's lack of soul. This item was used in Bram Stoker's Dracula and has remained popular with subsequent authors and filmmakers, with vampires not being able to be seen in mirrors. Some traditions also hold that vampires cannot enter a house unless being invited by the owner. After the first invitation, they can come and go as they please. This folkloric vampire is believed to be more active at night, but not generally considered vulnerable to sunlight. Reports literally in 1693 and 1694 concerning sightings of vampires in Poland and Russia had claimed that where the vampire's grave was recognized, eating bread baked with the blood mixed with flour, and even simply drinking it granted the possibility for protection. Other stories also claim that eating the dirt of a vampire's grave would have the same effect. Now, say you couldn't protect yourself, you couldn't identify them, and you couldn't prevent them. How do we destroy them? Well, there are methods to destroying suspected vampires, and it varies, with staking through the heart the most commonly cited method. Decapitation was also a preferred method in Germany and Western Slavic areas, with the head being buried between the feet, sometimes the buttocks or away from the body itself. The act was seen as a way of hastening the departure of the soul, in which culture said that it would linger with the corpse. The vampire's head, body, and clothes would also be spiked and pinned to the earth to prevent its rising. Romi people drove steel and iron needles into corpses' hearts and placed bits of steel in the mouth, over the eyes, ears, and between fingers at times of burial. Further measures included boiling water and pouring it over the grave or complete incineration of the body. This was popular in southeastern Europe, when a vampire could also be killed by being shot or drowned, repeatedly in a funeral service, by sprinkling holy water on the body, or even by Roman exorcisms. In Romania, garlic would be placed in the mouth of the recently deceased, and as of the 19th century, the precaution of shooting a bullet through the coffin was taken. And there you have it. I hope you enjoyed some of the vampiric cultures. I like to try to include some history with my true crime stories, also some deeper explanations and things in case you weren't aware, such as the Asperger's syndrome description, as well as this lengthy description into the vampire folklore. Let me know, did you like these descriptions? Did you enjoy the story? Let me know in social media. Again, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could read it in all the descriptions below, and also enjoy my other stories that I've done. I try to remain consistent, at least doing a story once every week or two. And if you have any suggestions for stories, drop me a line. Send me a message on Twitter, and I try to get back to people as fast as possible, usually within 24 to 48 hours. This concludes tonight's story. My name is DJ, and this was the Mythical True Crime Podcast. Good night. And that concludes another captivating episode, delving into the world of mythical true crime. I appreciate you joining me tonight as we listen to the facts from these true crime tales. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll uncover even more mysteries. Until then, thank you for listening to tonight's episode. Good night.